rained as if the sky had been holding its breath for weeks and finally exhaled. Clara Weston, 24, hurried along the cobbles with a tote bag shielding a stack of policy briefs, her umbrella collapsing in a gust like a dark flower. The cafe on the corner glowed with amber light, the windows fogged, a bell chiming as she pushed in. She smelled cinnamon and wet wool. Her hair clung to her cheeks. "Rough night?" a voice asked, warm and amused. She turned and found a man offering his umbrella, the good kind, black and sturdy, not the drugstore contraption shivering in her hand. "You look like you could use this more than I do." His suit was clean lines and quiet wealth, his smile practiced charm. "Ethan," he said as if the name were a key. "Clara," she replied, aware of her damp cardigan, the ink smudge on her thumb, the thud in her chest. He ordered 2 hot chocolates without asking, then said softly, "Let me guess, you read the footnotes first." She laughed before she could help it. He watched her the way city lights watch a river, curious, a little dazzled, already imagining a bridge. "Thank you for the rescue," she said, fingers around the glass mug, heat bleeding into her palms. "I'm not always this, windswept." Ethan shrugged. "I like windswept. It means the day tried to beat you and failed." The line landed like a spark. Clara felt seen in a way that wasn't about looks, but about effort. He asked what she did, and she told him, junior researcher at a community policy group, long hours, short pay, work that made her chest expand when a plan helped even a handful of people. He listened, nodding. When he spoke of himself, real estate, rapid promotion, a team he was molding, his words stacked like glass towers. "Let me walk you home," he offered, holding the umbrella over both their heads. On the slick pavement, he matched her pace. "I'm good at reading plans," he said, "but I'd like to learn how you read people." She glanced up. "Start with listening," she said. He smiled. "Already doing that." The rain softened to a hush, as if inviting the beginning to take root. The rooftop restaurant floated above the city like a ship at dusk, strings of bulbs, music low enough to make each voice intimate. Ethan had texted, "Dress how you're most yourself." Clara stood by the elevator in a navy dress she'd owned for years, a cardigan folded over her arm. When the doors opened, he was waiting at a table near the glass, skyline glittering at his back. "There you are," he said, standing. "You clean up beautifully, Ms. Footnotes." She smiled despite the pet name. A waiter poured water. Ethan asked questions that let her speak, and then circled back to details she thought he'd missed. She told him how policy could be scaffolding around the lives of people who never make headlines. He told her about an acquisition that would change his company's posture in 3 states, his eyes lighting with the thrill of leverage. "Do you ever get tired of the chase?" she asked, breaking bread. He leaned forward. "The chase is proof I'm alive." A wind moved the bulbs. Shadows swayed over their plates. "And you?" He studied her. "What's the moment that makes you feel it?" She thought of community halls that smelled like dust and hope. "When a grandmother says a bus route changed and she can shop without a taxi," she said. Silence settled vivid and respectful between them. "You're beautiful," he said then, quiet, sincere enough to make her throat tighten. "Not just," he gestured vaguely, "this, the way you believe." Later, in the elevator, his hand hovered near her back without touching. On the street, he opened the door of a sleek coupe and said, "One day I'll show you the city from angles it's been hiding." She looked at the streets she already loved from the ground and wondered what it would mean to love them from above, and whether elevation always required altitude. Clara's book club met on Wednesday in the bookstore beneath her flat, a warren of aisles where light pooled in honeyed puddles. Paperbacks leaned, the owner's tabby slept on a stack of poetry, and the smell of coffee drifted from a dented percolator. "You brought him," Maya whispered, widening her eyes at Ethan's crisp shirt, his watch that caught the lamp glow like a small moon. "He brought himself," Clara whispered back, half teasing, half nervous. They were discussing a novel about a city worker who maps hidden staircases. Ethan listened, polite, smiling at the right moments. When it was his turn, he said, "I admire the metaphor. But what if the point isn't the stairs? It's installing an elevator." Laughter rippled, good-natured but uncertain. During break, he drifted toward the door, glancing at his phone. "You okay?" Clara asked. He nodded. "It's sweet here," he said, and the word sweet landed with a thin sting. I'm just not used to this scale. She followed his gaze. Paper signs, chipped mugs, a bulletin board with community notices typed unevenly. It's where I breathe, she said. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, affectionate, soft. I want to know every version of where you breathe, he said. Back upstairs, she brewed chamomile while he stood at the window, looking at the street. You and your friends, he said. You make small things sound like revolutions. She smiled into the steam. Sometimes small is where revolutions begin. He kissed her forehead and murmured, I like how your sentences feel like doorways. She slept later with the window cracked and dreamed of staircases that kept their secrets, unless you climbed them slowly, hand on the rail, listening to the wooden sigh of each step. The cocktail party shimmered with sequins and statements about markets. Glass walls reflected conversation like a hall of mirrors. Ethan's colleague greeted them, Reynolds, and kissed the air near Clara's cheek. And you must be. Clara, Ethan said, his arm warm at her waist. She works in policy. Music threaded through the room like a clever lie. Clara tried to anchor herself with sips of sparkling water, but the chatter rushed. Deal flow, Q3 targets, a villa someone was considering acquiring, for the view. What do you do? A woman asked, tilting her head. I help map public problems to practical solutions, Clara answered. That sounds noble, the woman said, as if nobility were a brand of soap. On the terrace, the city was a platter of light. It's beautiful, Clara said. Ethan watched her profile more than the skyline. You belong anywhere, he told her. She wanted to believe him. Inside, a man joked about meaningful work the way you joke about a diet you'll never start. Ethan laughed, easy, quick, then squeezed Clara's hand, as if to say ignore him. Later, a photographer asked for a picture. Clara lifted her chin, feeling the unfamiliar weight of being looked at for her proximity rather than her contribution. In the car home, Ethan said, You were perfect. She laughed. Perfect is for crowns and glass slippers. Or emeralds, he said, eyes flicking to her earrings, a birthday gift he'd given with a card that read, For what you already are. She pressed her forehead to the cool window and watched the city blur, the glamour both a lovely costume and a garment that pinched. It began as tenderness that arrived dressed up like help. Try this instead, Ethan would say, offering a silk blouse folded in tissue. Maybe pin your hair back. It sharpens your jawline. Before a gala, he touched her lipstick with a napkin, murmuring, Less is more. Your face is the point. He meant well, she told herself, and sometimes it did feel like care. But often, as she crossed a room, she sensed the invisible adjustments, the way he guided her away from certain conversations, the way his smile warmed when her laugh aligned with the room's tone. Do you ever feel like a picture frame? She asked Maya over tea. Pretty but empty without what it's holding. Maya's eyes were gentle. Frames choose art too, she said. Don't forget you have a say. One evening, Ethan stood behind Clara at her mirror. You're stunning, he said, and she felt it, then he added, We'll tuck that policy talk away tonight. These people aren't here for essays. She turned. But I am, she said softly. He kissed her temple. I know, and I love that in you. We're just playing to the audience. At the event, a councilman's wife said, You're the one who tames Ethan, with a conspiratorial smile. Clara wanted to answer, No one tames anyone here. We're just taking turns steering. On the ride home, Ethan mentioned a boutique she had to try. She mentioned a lecture on equitable transit she wanted to attend. Their plans slid past each other like trains at night, lights flashing, windows full of strangers. At a company dinner, the room thrummed with polished laughter. Ethan, magnetic, told a story about negotiating down a stubborn seller. He blinked first, he said, triumphant. When introductions circled, he gestured to Clara. This is Clara. She keeps me honest. The table chuckled. A partner leaned in. And what does honest do from 9 to 5? Community policy, Ethan said lightly. She's very good at people things. The phrase landed like a pat on the head. Clara smiled, her throat tightening. Later, at the bar, she heard a junior associate whisper, He could do better, someone who works the room, not rooms where people complain. The laugh that followed was soft but sharp as a paper cut. On the drive home, Ethan drummed the steering wheel. You were quiet. She stared out at traffic, red lights winking like warning buoys. I didn't have much to add. He glanced over. You always do. She tried to translate the ache. Sometimes I feel like I'm a painting you hang when it suits the decor. He frowned. I brought you because I'm proud of you. Then let me be the full picture, she said. Silence hummed. At her building, he kissed her goodnight and said, You're overthinking. Upstairs, she leaned against her door and let the tears come. Not because the night had broken her, but because hairline fractures demand attention before they become a shatter. She wrote in her notebook, Love is not a stage. It's a room with 2 chairs. Both must be comfortable. They had planned a weekend by the sea, cheap inn, long walks, a promise to turn off their phones. Clara packed sandwiches and a dog-eared novel. Friday noon, Ethan called. I'm so sorry. They've got a yacht thing, networking. It's important. She swallowed. We made this plan weeks ago. I know, he said, voice butter soft. This could move the dial. She stared at the sandwiches. Go, she replied, surprising herself with the steadiness. Do what you think matters. You matter, he insisted. After this closes, I'll plan something huge. I don't need huge, she said. The line sat between them, a bridge suspended over a widening river. Saturday, Clara walked the canal alone, the city wearing its weekend clothes. She watched a father tie a ribbon in his daughter's hair and felt a longing not for children yet, but for gentleness that shows up when it says it will. Maya called. How's the sea? Imaginary, Clara said, attempting a smile. That evening, she made soup, opened the novel, and tried to let the quiet be a guest rather than a verdict. At midnight, Ethan texted a photo, him on a deck, lights like spilled jewelry on water. Wish you were here, he wrote. She typed, deleted, typed. Wish you were here and sent nothing. The soup cooled. The ache didn't. At the policy group, Clara thrived. Her boss began handing her the thorny projects, the ones that needed patience and a spine. You see the shape in the smoke, he told her, sliding a file across the table. She spent afternoons mapping bus routes against shift schedules, nights drafting briefs in the quiet hum of her apartment. The work didn't care what she wore or whether her laugh calibrated to a room. It cared whether she kept going. Meanwhile, Ethan scaled invisible ladders, his calendar a grid of strategy breakfasts and celebratory dinners. When they met, they traded highlights like postcards. We locked the Riverside deal, he said, eyes bright. We got the council to pilot an evening shuttle, she said, heartbeat quick. But beneath the postcards lay different maps. Ethan's sentences leaned future, his verbs sharp with acquisition. Clara's leaned present, her verbs soft with holding. One night she found him in her kitchen, tie undone, reading her timeline on a legal pad. I'm proud of you, he said, kissing her hair. You're making ripples, she smiled. Ripples still move boats, she replied. He grinned, but his eyes slid to a notification on his phone. What if, he mused, you helped me on a project, just the messaging? You'd be incredible. I could, she said, if it didn't bend what I believe. He exhaled, somewhere between admiration and impatience. The gap wasn't loud. It was a quiet widening, a river eroding its banks, certain and slow. The evening at the Selwyn Club had been Ethan's idea, an intimate dinner for friends who matter. Clara arrived in a pale lavender dress, her hair swept up loosely, the scent of vanilla drifting from her scarf. The room was candlelit, filled with low laughter and the muted chime of silverware. As she excused herself to the washroom, she passed a pair of Ethan's colleagues standing by the marble bar. Their voices were pitched in that careless way people speak when they think they are unheard. She's pleasant, one said with a half shrug. But nothing that turns heads. You'd think Reynolds would be with someone who makes an entrance. The other chuckled, swirling his wine. He'll upgrade eventually. This is a placeholder. Clara froze mid-step, heat rising to her cheeks as if she'd been slapped. For a second, she considered walking away, but something in her made her linger in the shadow of the doorway. Then she heard it, Ethan's voice joining them, a short, almost amused laugh. He didn't defend her, didn't counter with a story about her mind, her work, her spirit. The lack of words was louder than cruelty. She turned quickly and walked the long way back to the table, her reflection in the hallway's mirrors seeming like a stranger's. When she sat down, Ethan was leaning back in his chair, the conversation now about an investment property. He glanced at her, smiling as if nothing had shifted in the world. You okay? he asked, his tone light, unaware or uncaring that something had cracked. Perfect, she lied, taking a sip of water to keep her voice steady. For the rest of the evening, she performed the role flawlessly, laughing where the table laughed, nodding where agreement was expected. Inside, however, her thoughts were miles away, retracing the words she'd overheard and replaying the gap of silence where his defense should have been. Later, as they stood in the club's lobby waiting for the valet, Ethan slid an arm around her waist. "You were charming tonight," he said. Clara forced a smile, feeling as though the word charming was a thin ribbon tied around something fragile and cracking inside her. She wondered if the other women in the room had felt this way before, decorated, displayed, but never truly claimed for who they were. The car arrived, and as Ethan held the door open, she caught her reflection in the black window. The woman looking back at her was smiling, but her eyes were beginning to ask dangerous questions. It was supposed to be just another evening. A colleague of Ethan's hosting an autumn party at his sprawling estate. The night was crisp, leaves skittering across the driveway as they arrived. Inside, the chandeliers blazed, laughter spilled from every corner, and glasses clinked in an endless rhythm. Clara, in a deep burgundy dress, drifted toward the fireplace where a group was discussing city developments. She was halfway through explaining a point about transit accessibility when she caught sight of Ethan across the room, standing with three men in tailored suits. Their laughter carried easily above the music. She didn't mean to overhear, but the way his voice lifted made her turn slightly toward him. "Clara's sweet," he was saying, "but let's be honest, without me, she'd fade away. She doesn't have that drive to make it big." The men laughed, one clapping him on the shoulder. Her breath caught. It was as if the air itself had been replaced with ice. She couldn't move for a moment, her mind replaying each word in slow motion, branding them into her memory. She slipped away without waiting for him to notice. The night air outside was sharp, the stars blurring as she blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. Her heels clicked on the driveway, echoing in the quiet distance from the music inside. She didn't call a cab immediately. Instead, she walked, letting the cold bite her skin, each step both a punishment and a strange release. The more she moved, the more she realized this wasn't a wound she could bandage. It was an arrow through the center of who she believed she was to him. She thought of all the times she had defended him to friends, brushed off small humiliations, told herself love required a certain flexibility. But love was not supposed to require the bending of your spine until you could no longer stand tall. By the time she reached the corner and hailed a cab, her hands were numb, but her mind was painfully awake. As she slid into the back seat, the driver glanced at her in the mirror. "Rough night?" he asked. She gave a small, humorless smile. "A clarifying one," she replied, watching the estate's lights fade into the distance like a world she was no longer sure she belonged to. The next week, an industry mixer brought them to the center of the city. Ethan was all charm, his hand at the small of her back, introducing her to people she barely had time to register before he was off to the next conversation. She endured the night like someone wearing shoes a size too small. At the end, instead of taking the car service arranged for them, Clara told Ethan she wanted some air. "I'll meet you at your place," she said lightly. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Don't take too long," he replied. When she stepped onto the street, the city's usual hum felt louder, honking cars, snippets of conversation, the rattle of a passing tram. She walked with no real direction, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm. Each street lamp cast her shadow longer, thinner, as if stretching it into something unrecognizable. She thought about the countless nights she'd walked beside him, adjusting her stride to match his, laughing when he told her to keep up. But tonight, her pace was her own. The words from that autumn party echoed like a cruel refrain in her head. Without me, she'd fade away. She replayed the absence of his defense when others dismissed her, the subtle corrections that chipped at her edges, the way he always seemed to shine brighter in public while she dimmed herself just enough not to overshadow his light. A fine mist began to fall, cool against her cheeks. She didn't run for cover. She welcomed it, let it slick her hair against her face, blur the lines of her makeup. By the time she reached her apartment building, she was soaked through. the city's dampness clinging to her skin. She looked up at the narrow windows, warm squares in the dark, and felt the strange, almost electric certainty that she could walk into her future alone if she had to. And maybe, just maybe, she already was. The next evening, Ethan arrived at her apartment, leaning casually in the doorway as if nothing had shifted. "You disappeared the other night," he said, stepping inside. Clara closed the door slowly, her fingers lingering on the knob. "I needed to think," she replied. He arched an eyebrow. "About what?" She met his gaze. "About how it feels to hear the person you love tell a room full of people you'd fade without him." His expression flickered, but only for a moment. "You're being too sensitive, Clara. It was just conversation." "It was humiliation," she corrected. "Do you understand what that feels like? To be reduced to an accessory in your own relationship?" Ethan sighed, moving to pour himself a drink. "You know I didn't mean it like that. People exaggerate in those settings. It's part of the game." "Whose game?" she asked. "Because I don't remember signing up." He turned, drink in hand, his voice smoothing over the edges. "You're overreacting. I build us up out there. I make sure people see you by my side." "They see me," she said quietly, "but they don't know me. And you've done nothing to change that." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Ethan shrugged eventually. "If you want to make this into a big deal, I can't stop you." Clara took a deep breath. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But you can stop pretending it isn't one." He looked at her for a long moment before turning away, sipping his drink. She realized then that the gulf between them wasn't about one sentence. It was about everything unspoken that had been piling up for months. In the days that followed, Clara moved through their relationship like a ghost haunting her own life. Dinners out were quieter. She no longer offered the easy laughter that had once made Ethan glance at her with warmth. He didn't ask why. Instead, he filled the silence with stories from work, closing deals, new contacts, the politics of promotions. She listened, nodding, her mind elsewhere. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away, but she didn't curl her fingers into his either. It was a strange limbo, the shell of intimacy without the pulse. She spent more time at the policy office, lingering over projects long after her colleagues had gone home. The work absorbed her, reminded her she could build things outside of him. One Friday night, Ethan suggested a weekend getaway to shake off the tension. Clara agreed, though a part of her already knew it wouldn't change anything. They drove to the coast, the car filled with the sound of the radio instead of conversation. Walking along the boardwalk that evening, Ethan draped his jacket over her shoulders. But the gesture felt rehearsed, like a move he knew would score points rather than a genuine reflex. "You've been distant," he remarked. "We've both been distant," she replied. "Maybe we need to figure out why." He smiled faintly, as if humoring her. "I already know why. You're holding on to something small instead of focusing on what we have." She looked out at the ocean, dark and endless. "Sometimes," she said, "what you call small is the thing that eventually swallows the shore." The waves crashed, swallowing her words into the night, but she knew she'd spoken them more for herself than for him. Clara sat at her small kitchen table on a gray Sunday morning, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. The rain streaked the window like blurred ink, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly, pulling her into thoughts she had been trying to avoid. She glanced at the notebook open in front of her, half filled with policy notes, but now overtaken by scribbles of personal reflections. What is love without respect? What is respect without truth? She had spent the last week watching Ethan move through their shared moments with the same polished ease as always, while she carried an invisible weight on her chest. Her mind played back not just the cutting remarks, but the patterns, the way his world seemed to have no place for her voice unless it complemented his narrative. "People can change," she whispered to herself. But even as the words left her lips, she felt the sting of doubt. Change requires recognition, and Ethan didn't see a problem. He saw her silence as compliance. She realized that she'd been treating her own needs as disruptions to be managed quietly rather than truths worth speaking loudly. That realization made her shoulders square for the first time in weeks. By evening, she was pacing her apartment, her mind steady in a way it hadn't been for months. She knew she would have to face him, not with accusations, but with the certainty that her life couldn't continue in the shadow of someone else's ego. Maya's voice rang in her ear from a conversation earlier. You've built your own spine. Don't let anyone ask you to bend it just to make them taller. Clara wasn't angry anymore, she was clear. The clarity felt like standing in a room where all the windows had been thrown open, letting in air she didn't know she'd been missing. She thought about the woman she wanted to be at 30, at 40, the woman who could look herself in the mirror and know she hadn't traded her dignity for companionship. Picking up her phone, she typed a message to Ethan. We need to talk tomorrow evening. At my place. She stared at the blinking cursor before hitting send. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. Clara opened her window and let the night breeze in, as if inviting her future to sit beside her for a moment before it arrived fully. Ethan arrived at her apartment the next evening, his usual easy confidence preceding him through the door. So, he said, leaning casually against the counter, what's this about? You sounded formal. Clara gestured for him to sit. She took the armchair across from the couch, deliberately leaving the coffee table between them like a neutral border. I've been thinking about us, she began. He smiled faintly, as though amused by the seriousness in her voice. We all have bad weeks, Clara. It'll pass. She shook her head. This isn't about a bad week. It's about how I feel when I'm with you and how I don't feel seen or respected. His smile faltered just slightly. You're overcomplicating things. No, she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. I'm clarifying them. I've been giving you the best parts of me, and you've treated them like filler, nice to have, but not essential. That's not a life I can keep living. He leaned back, crossing his arms. You think you'll do better without me? The question wasn't curiosity, it was challenge. Clara met his gaze without blinking. I know I'll do differently, and right now, different is better. There was a pause, heavy and still. Then he laughed, not warmly, but with that dismissive edge she'd grown to recognize. You'll see one day, Clara. I was the best thing that ever happened to you. She rose from her chair, moving to the door. Maybe, she said, opening it for him, but you weren't the right thing. He stepped past her, his cologne lingering in the air like the echo of a performance. When the door clicked shut behind him, she leaned against it for a moment, feeling a strange mix of grief and release. Her apartment felt different, emptier, yes, but also wider, as if she just reclaimed unseen square footage. She walked to the window and looked out over the street, watching the lights blur in the damp air. For the first time in a long time, she didn't wonder where Ethan was going. She wondered where she would go next. The days after Ethan's departure were oddly quiet, a silence that at first felt like a void but gradually revealed itself as space. Clara noticed small things she hadn't before, how the morning light painted the corner of her kitchen in gold, how the hum of the old refrigerator was like a low, steady heartbeat in the background. She moved slowly through her routines, relearning the rhythms of living alone. She brewed her coffee the way she liked it, strong and a little bitter, without worrying whether it matched someone else's taste. She read in bed until midnight without glancing at a clock, and when she woke, there was no sound of another person moving about impatiently. The absence of Ethan's voice, once so constant, became a canvas on which she could hear her own thoughts again. She wrote in her notebook each morning, not about loss, but about ideas, things she wanted to try, places she wanted to visit, skills she'd put aside. But grief didn't disappear just because she'd chosen the separation. It came in waves, sudden and unexpected, passing a restaurant where they'd once laughed over shared pasta, finding his tie at the back of her closet, smelling a trace of his cologne on her scarf. She let herself feel it without rushing it away. In those moments, she reminded herself that endings, no matter how necessary, are still endings. One evening, she sat cross-legged on her couch, sorting through a box of photos and cards. Her fingers hovered over a picture of them from their first summer together, both of them tanned and smiling. She studied her own eyes in the image, trying to see if they held any hint of the questions that would come later. After a long moment, she slid the photo into an envelope and tucked it into the back of a drawer, not to erase it, but to place it where it belonged. in the past. That night, she fell asleep with the window open, listening to the city's quiet, the sound not empty but open, like the breath before a first step into something new. Clara's return to herself began in the smallest ways. She stopped dressing for someone else's approval, choosing clothes that felt like her instead of ones she'd been told photographed well. She lingered in the office long after the others left, not because she was avoiding home, but because the work pulled her in. Her boss noticed her renewed focus. "You've been on fire lately," he remarked during a meeting, handing her a project that would have once gone to a senior researcher. She accepted it with a quiet thrill, spending nights immersed in data, proposals, and calls to community contacts. For the first time in years, she felt her mind stretching again, unbound by the need to balance someone else's ego. The satisfaction of seeing a plan take shape under her direction was a kind of intimacy she hadn't realized she'd been craving. Outside of work, she began saying yes to things she'd once turned down, dinners with friends without checking if Ethan would approve, early morning runs along the river, weekend trips to nearby towns just to see what was there. She found herself laughing more easily, her conversations no longer guarded for fear of being too much or off-brand. One Saturday, while browsing in a second-hand bookshop, she ran into an old university professor who remembered her as the student with too many questions. They talked for an hour about policy shifts and upcoming public debates, and as Clara walked away, she realized she hadn't once thought about how she looked or whether someone was watching. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, reviewing her week. The emptiness that had once been filled with Ethan's presence was now filled with her own. It wasn't about replacing him. It was about returning to herself, piece by piece, until she could see the whole again. It happened after a public meeting on workplace equality, held in a cramped but lively community hall. Clara had spoken on a panel outlining ideas for bridging the gap between policy and actual practice. When the applause died down, a woman in her 50s approached her, introducing herself as part of the leadership for a growing grassroots women's movement. "We've been following your work," she said warmly. "We think you could help us shape our strategy for the next year." Clara was taken aback. "I'm flattered," she replied, "but I'm not sure I'm the person you need." The woman smiled knowingly. "That humility is exactly why you are." They exchanged contact information, and as Clara walked home, her mind buzzed not with hesitation but with possibility. This was the kind of work that felt alive under her hands. Later that week, she attended her first planning session with the group. The energy in the room was electric, filled with women from all walks of life, lawyers, teachers, small business owners, each bringing their own perspective to the table. Clara listened more than she spoke at first, but when she did contribute, her ideas drew nods and thoughtful murmurs. She left that night feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. On the bus ride home, she texted Maya, "I think I've found my next chapter." Maya replied instantly, "Told you your story wasn't over." Clara smiled at her reflection in the window, the city lights flickering past. It wasn't about proving Ethan wrong anymore. It was about proving herself right. The following months became a blur of late nights and early mornings. Clara threw herself into the movement's work with a passion that surprised even her. She spent hours poring over research, drafting proposals, and coordinating town halls in neighborhoods often ignored by policymakers. The exhaustion was real, but so was the exhilaration. Each successful meeting, each small policy win, felt like fuel. One evening, as she sat in the dim light of her kitchen surrounded by papers, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the movement's founders. "Your proposal for the mentorship program was approved." Clara let out a laugh of pure relief and pride. It wasn't just that her ideas were being heard, it was that they were being acted upon. She found herself building relationships with people who valued her for her mind and her commitment, not for how well she could blend into a backdrop. These connections began to form a network of trust and mutual respect that she hadn't realized she was missing. At one strategy meeting, a colleague said, "You make people feel like they're part of the solution, not just the problem." Clara took it as the highest compliment. She started carrying a small notebook everywhere, jotting down observations, quotes, and flashes of inspiration. Each page became a testament to the fact that she had not only survived the end of her relationship, she had begun to thrive in ways she hadn't anticipated. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful, and in the quiet hours after each victory, she could feel the outline of her future becoming clearer. Clara didn't notice the attention at first. She was too focused on the work to realize that her name was beginning to circulate in rooms she'd never entered. It started with a mention in a local newspaper article about the movement's successes, then a radio interview request, and soon after, an invitation to speak at a regional policy conference. Standing at the podium in a crisp navy dress, she felt the weight of the moment, not as a performance, but as a culmination of years of steady, unseen labor. Her speech drew not only applause, but also several requests for follow-up meetings. Afterward, a city council member approached her, saying, "We need more voices like yours in higher places." It was at one of these follow-up meetings that she first heard the name Nathaniel Hayes. The governor's aides were looking for someone with a strong connection to community work and a proven ability to bridge policy and people. "You've built credibility where it matters most," one aide told her. Clara listened, intrigued but cautious. She had learned to measure opportunities not by their shine, but by their alignment with her values. Still, something about this felt different, like a door opening onto a room she'd once thought was locked to her. That evening, walking home under the glow of street lamps, she felt the distinct pull of change on the horizon. The air seemed charged, the way it does before a storm, full of the possibility that, once it breaks, nothing will look quite the same again. The email came late on a Thursday evening, just as Clara was finishing revisions on a community policy brief. The subject line read, "Opportunity to collaborate." At first, she thought it was another request from a local council, but as she scanned the message, her breath caught. The sender was a senior aide to Governor Nathaniel Hayes. The aide wrote about hearing her speak at the regional policy conference, praising her ability to articulate practical solutions without losing sight of the human cost. They wanted to meet, no formal commitment yet, just a conversation to explore her joining the governor's re-election campaign as a strategist. Clara sat back in her chair, reading the email twice, then a third time, the weight of its significance settling in. She called Maya immediately. "Maya, the governor's team reached out," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. "Are you serious?" "Clara, this is huge," Maya practically shouted. "It's not a job offer yet," Clara cautioned, "but it's something." She spent the next 2 days preparing for the meeting, researching every policy position Nathaniel had taken, analyzing his previous campaigns, and jotting down questions. On the morning of the meeting, she stood in front of her mirror, wearing a charcoal suit that felt both professional and true to herself. As she headed out, she reminded herself of something she had once written in her notebook. "Walk into the room as the person you already are, not the one you're trying to prove exists." The governor's office was grand without being ostentatious, walls lined with framed photographs of town visits, school openings, and quiet moments with constituents. Clara was led into a conference room where Governor Nathaniel Hayes was already seated, reviewing a folder. He looked up as she entered, standing to shake her hand. "Ms. Weston," he said with a warm smile, "thank you for coming on such short notice." His voice carried a calm authority, and his handshake was firm but not overbearing. Clara took a seat across from him, her portfolio resting on the polished table. "Thank you for the invitation, Governor," she replied. They spoke for nearly an hour, their conversation flowing easily from policy specifics to broader visions for the state's future. "What you did with the Workplace Equality Initiative," he said, "that's the kind of grassroots connection we're missing in our messaging." Clara felt seen in a way that was different from any professional interaction she'd had before, not as a token or a background presence, but as a partner in thought. As the meeting ended, Nathaniel said, "I think you could be an asset to this team. Let's start with you sitting in on strategy sessions next week." Clara left the building with the crisp winter air biting at her cheeks. Her steps quickened not by the cold, but by the quiet exhilaration of knowing she had just stepped into a new chapter of her life. The first week on the governor's campaign team was a blur of meetings, whiteboards covered in bullet points, and the hum of ideas bouncing between people who understood urgency. Clara quickly found her place, not by dominating the room, but by asking the right questions and connecting disparate suggestions into cohesive plans. On the third night, long after most of the staff had gone home, Nathaniel found her in the conference room, surrounded by drafts and sticky notes. "Still here?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Just tightening the language on the education policy proposal," she replied. He stepped closer, scanning the page. "You have a gift for making complexity feel human," he said quietly. They ended up talking for another hour, not just about policy, but about leadership, public trust, and the challenge of staying true to your values when the political landscape shifts beneath your feet. "The work is relentless," Nathaniel admitted, "but people notice when you show up every single day, even when the cameras aren't rolling." Clara nodded. "That's the only way I know how to work." When they finally stepped outside, the streets were empty, the city bathed in the orange glow of street lamps. "Get some rest," he told her as they parted ways. "We need your mind sharp for tomorrow." As she walked to her car, she realized she felt more energized now, in the quiet aftermath of a long day, than she ever had after the glittering events of her past. Over the next few months, Clara and Nathaniel's working relationship deepened. It wasn't born from grand gestures, but from the steady rhythm of shared purpose. They exchanged ideas over quick lunches between meetings, debated respectfully over differing strategies, and celebrated small campaign wins with quiet nods of mutual respect. One evening, during a long drive back from a rural town hall, they found themselves talking about personal histories. Nathaniel spoke of losing his wife 5 years earlier, the ache still present but softened by time. Clara shared fragments of her past without dwelling on pain, focusing instead on the lessons she had carried forward. "You seem like someone who doesn't waste hurt," Nathaniel observed. "You turn it into direction," she smiled faintly. "I try to." The miles rolled by under the hum of the engine, the conversation alternating between comfortable silence and bursts of laughter. By the time they returned to the city, Clara was aware of a subtle shift. Not romantic yet, but the kind of respect that forms the strongest foundation for whatever might follow. In the days that followed, she noticed Nathaniel seeking her opinion more often, sometimes on matters outside her formal role. And she found herself caring about his well-being beyond the scope of the campaign, catching small signs of fatigue and urging him to take breaks. It was a quiet, mutual investment, built without pretense, and it began to anchor her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The campaign office was buzzing one Friday afternoon when Nathaniel walked in carrying 2 coffees. "For my favorite strategist," he said, placing one on Clara's desk. She laughed softly. "Careful, Governor, someone might start rumors." He grinned. "Let them. They'll only be half wrong." It was the kind of teasing that carried more warmth than risk, and it lingered between them for the rest of the day. As the weeks went on, their interactions began to take on a more personal texture. Inside jokes during tense meetings, shared glances when a point landed perfectly in a speech, quiet walks back to their cars after evening events. There was no declaration, no sudden crossing of lines, just an unspoken understanding that something was growing in the space between strategy sessions and public appearances. One evening, after a successful debate, they stood on the steps of the campaign headquarters, watching the city lights flicker. "You've been good for this campaign," Nathaniel said, his voice softer than usual. "And for me." Clara met his eyes, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the mild night air. "You've been good for me too," she admitted. They didn't touch, didn't need to. The connection was in the pause that followed, in the way their eyes held a conversation their mouths weren't yet ready to speak. When they finally said goodnight, Clara walked to her car with the sense that she was no longer just working on a campaign. She was building something far more personal, something that could not be measured in poll numbers or headlines. The garden behind the governor's residence was alive with the quiet hum of spring, roses opening in slow confidence, bees drifting lazily between blooms. Clara had been called there under the pretense of reviewing campaign outreach plans. Nathaniel stood by the old stone fountain, hands in his pockets, his suit jacket draped over a chair. "You've been carrying this campaign on your shoulders more than you realize," he said as she approached. She smiled, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. "I'd say we've been carrying it together." His eyes softened in a way that made her pulse quicken. He reached into his pocket, not for a note or a pen, but for a small velvet box. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but warm, "you've become more than a colleague. More than an advisor, you've become my anchor." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, elegant in its understatement. Her breath caught, and for a moment, words failed her. "Nathaniel, he stepped closer, taking her hand. "You don't have to give me an answer for the cameras, or for anyone else. Just for yourself." The sincerity in his gaze stripped away the noise of her past, leaving only the truth of the present. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. His smile widened, and he slid the ring onto her finger. The weight of it felt less like an ornament and more like a promise. They stood there for a moment in the mild spring air, the scent of roses mingling with the distant sound of the city. It wasn't a grand public spectacle. It was private, intentional, and exactly what she needed. As they walked back inside, she thought of how far she'd come from the woman who once measured her worth through someone else's eyes. This choice, this future, was hers. Election night was a storm of flashing cameras, jubilant shouts, and the rhythmic hum of the tally board updating in real time. Clara stood at the edge of the campaign headquarters, watching the numbers climb steadily in Nathaniel's favor. Staffers dashed between screens and phones, the air thick with anticipation. Nathaniel's hand found hers briefly as he passed, a subtle reassurance amid the chaos. "Almost there," he whispered. When the final districts reported, the roar in the room was deafening. Victory had been secured by a margin so wide, it silenced any doubt about their strategy. Clara allowed herself a small smile, knowing the months of relentless work had been worth every late night and early morning. The celebration spilled onto the streets, supporters waving signs and chanting his name. Nathaniel found her in the crowd, pulling her close for a quiet moment away from the cameras. "You made this possible," he said, his voice low but certain. She shook her head, but he squeezed her hand. "I mean it, Clara." The team announced plans for a grand victory gala at the Grand Marlowe Hotel, a night to mark not just the win, but the beginning of his next term. As she stood on the balcony later that night, looking down at the city alight with celebration, she felt a deep sense of belonging. Not as an accessory to someone else's triumph, but as an architect of it. This time, her presence wasn't granted as a favor, it was earned, and everyone in the room knew it. The day of the gala dawned with a crisp clarity, the kind of weather that made the city's skyline seem etched in glass. Clara spent the afternoon in a quiet room at the hotel, her hair being swept into an elegant chignon while her makeup artist worked with gentle precision. Draped over the chair was the gown Nathaniel had surprised her with, a deep emerald green that caught the light in ripples, its silhouette tailored to perfection. As she slipped it on, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was composed, steady, and entirely her own. "Governor's wife," her stylist teased with a smile, fastening the last clasp. Clara returned the smile, but thought privately. "First lady in my own right." Downstairs, the ballroom was a swirl of opulence, golden chandeliers, floral arrangements that seemed to defy gravity, and the low murmur of guests arriving. Nathaniel, in a classic black tuxedo, met her at the base of the grand staircase. "You look." He paused as if searching for the right word. "Unforgettable," she laughed softly. "You clean up well yourself." He offered his arm, and together they prepared to make their entrance. But for Clara, the moment was more than a display. It was a quiet reckoning. Every step in those heels carried the weight of the path she had carved for herself, from rain-soaked streets to this gilded hall. She was no longer the woman someone could dismiss as ordinary. Tonight, she would stand in the full light of her own story. As Clara and Nathaniel began their descent down the staircase, the hum of conversation quieted, replaced by the collective rustle of bodies turning toward them. Camera flashes lit the marble steps like bursts of lightning. She smiled easily, her hand light on Nathaniel's arm. Then, midway down, her gaze caught on a familiar face near the edge of the crowd. Ethan. His hair was styled to perfection, his suit immaculate, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He was speaking to one of Nathaniel's aides, gesturing with a file in hand, likely some proposal, some plea for access. The moment their eyes met, his words faltered. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Clara didn't falter in her steps. She let her expression remain serene, unbothered, her attention returning to the man beside her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Ethan's jaw tighten, his posture stiffening as if bracing against an unseen blow. Nathaniel guided her toward the dais, oblivious to the history that had just passed silently between them. As she took her place beside the governor, Clara realized she felt no urge for revenge, no lingering wound to salve. The sight of him there, reduced to seeking favor in a room where she now held influence, was enough. It wasn't triumph she felt, it was closure. And closure, she thought, was the most luxurious thing she had ever worn. Later in the evening, after speeches and toasts, Clara made her way through the crowd on Nathaniel's arm, greeting dignitaries and old friends. They moved slowly, every few steps bringing another handshake or congratulatory remark. She saw Ethan again, now standing alone near the edge of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in his hand. His eyes followed her, a mix of disbelief and something darker, regret, perhaps, though she no longer cared enough to label it. As they drew closer, he straightened as if to speak, but Clara kept her gaze level, her smile warm for the guests she passed. Nathaniel introduced her to a business leader standing just feet from Ethan. "This is my wife," Nathaniel said proudly, "and my most trusted advisor." The words hung in the air, and Clara could feel their weight settle on Ethan without ever looking directly at him. She thanked the man graciously, her voice steady, and they moved on. In that moment, she understood that true vindication was not about confrontation. It was about living so fully in the life you built that the past no longer has a claim on you. As she and Nathaniel exited the ballroom to the sound of applause, she didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Whatever story Ethan told himself from this night on, it would be one where he was just a figure in the crowd, watching the woman he once underestimated walk away, her head high, her future entirely her own. Here's the Bible verse. "The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." Psalm 118, verses 22 to 23 NKJV. This verse mirrors Clara's journey. She was dismissed, undervalued, and underestimated, yet rose to a place of honor and influence by God's providence. Moral of the story: never let someone else's opinion define your worth. People may underestimate you, belittle you, or believe you can't survive without them. But your value comes from your resilience, integrity, and purpose. Success is not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right and walking boldly into the life you are meant to live. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.